Welcome to Historia Haya's Exploration and Colonization series. In this episode, we're going to dive deep into the complex and deeply troubling history of the arrival of enslaved Africans to the American colonies. Through our exploration, we'll gain a greater understanding of the lasting effects of slavery on American society and how it has shaped the country we know today. Quick recap: indentured servants. In our last episode, we learned that enslaved Africans were not the only group of people brought to the colonies to work as laborers. Indentured servants, who were primarily poor Europeans, were also brought over to work for a certain number of years in exchange for passage to the colonies. However, the treatment of indentured servants was not as harsh as that of enslaved Africans. Unlike slaves, indentured servants were not considered property and had the potential to gain their freedom after their service was complete. The Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was a tragic chapter in human history, where millions of Africans were forced to leave their homes and endure a treacherous voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. The conditions on the ships were inhumane, with slaves packed tightly together, often chained and bound, with barely any room to move. The lack of adequate sanitation and the close quarters led to the spread of disease, and many slaves died from illnesses such as dysentery and smallpox. The slave traders would often cram as many slaves onto the ships as possible, with little regard for their well-being, resulting in even more fatalities. The arrival. Despite the horrors of the Middle Passage, many enslaved Africans did survive the journey and arrived in the American colonies. The first enslaved Africans are believed to have arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, in 1619, but others were brought to the Spanish colonies in Florida as early as 1526. Regardless of the exact date and location, the arrival of these enslaved Africans marked the beginning of a brutal chapter in American history. The growth of slavery. As the colonies grew, so did the institution of slavery. Enslaved Africans were forced to work on tobacco plantations in Virginia, rice fields in South Carolina, and sugar plantations in the Caribbean. The demand for enslaved labor was insatiable, and the slave trade became a major source of wealth for European nations and American colonizers alike. Impact on society. The impact of slavery on American society was profound. Enslaved Africans were denied their basic human rights, and families were torn apart as they were bought and sold like property. The economy of the colonies depended on the labor of enslaved Africans, and the brutal treatment they received helped to reinforce racial hierarchies that would persist for centuries. Resistance and rebellion. Despite the brutal conditions of slavery, enslaved Africans resisted their enslavement in a variety of ways. Some ran away and formed maroon communities, while others engaged in acts of sabotage and rebellion. The most famous of these rebellions was the 1831 slave revolt led by Nat Turner, which resulted in the deaths of over 50 white people. Key takeaways. The legacy of slavery in the American colonies and the United States is still being felt today. The institution of slavery was abolished in 1865, but the effects of slavery and racism are still evident in American society. The arrival of enslaved Africans and the horrors of the Middle Passage were a dark chapter in American history, but it is important to remember the resilience and resistance of the people who endured it. Thanks for watching this episode of Historia Haya's Exploration and Colonization series, where we discover the past to understand the present.